Hi, we have been getting the results of the second quarter for most of the entertainment industry companies. Disney is actually just finishing its third quarter. So let's take an overall look at the fiscal health of the entertainment industry. It is not a surprise to anyone to hear that the entertainment industry has been going through a lot of challenges. Most of these challenges are, and I hate to say this, self-inflicted. And so the karma police is playing a great deal of catch up right now. And that means that people who are entering the industry might be dissuaded from following their ambitions. I want to say that is probably the biggest mistake you can make long term, because when the industry is at one of its down points is usually the best time to enter it. Now, you might not enter it doing exactly what you want to do, where you want to do it, and how you want to do it. But especially if you're a beginner, any time you get in will ultimately be a good time because you can see not only how people get themselves out of a jam, but you'll also hear tertiarily why they got into that jam. And therefore, once you get into a position of power, you will be able to at least have some experience in knowing how some of these problems can be solved. Now, you might say, well, what if I don't want to be in a position of power? I want to be a creative. Well, that's fine too. But once you've been through a bad time, you know what bad times look like. You know what comes after them. You know how to fill in the gaps that will be all important for you to get your foot in the door if you haven't been able to do it thus far. So even though a lot of the stuff we'll be talking about today appears to be negative, it's going to ultimately lead to a positive. And you might say, Dan, how can you say that? It's worse than it's ever been. And one of the things I constantly tell my students is that any time and anywhere you're in the entertainment industry, you will always have the veterans of the industry saying it's worse than it's ever been. And that's because the entertainment industry is always changing. And as it changes, different sectors rise and fall. And the best thing to do is to be aware of what a rise and fall looks like and not cling on to the past, but instead look for where the opportunities are in the future. What has become a little bit more challenging in the past 10 to 15 years is the fact that there's so much information available too quickly. And what do I mean by that? I mean that because of the need for a lot of YouTube channels, for a lot of newspapers, for a lot of magazines, for a lot of online content in order to give the perception of relevance, that you will have a story break and get people hysterical before all the facts are in. And moreover, you often have a lot of the articles written or spoken about from a position of absolute ignorance. And that position of absolute ignorance isn't necessarily, especially in the YouTubeverse, the commentator's fault. The commentator is doing what they always do, which is they do a little bit of research on articles that are online, whether they're from Deadline, whether they're from Variety, whether they're from Hollywood Reporter, whether they're from any number of other sources. But the problem is, many of those writers have, as far as I'm concerned, shown an absolute ignorance of how things have worked long term. And if you don't know how the industry has worked long term, how can you even begin to hazard a guess as how to get out of the problem? You had to have seen it, or you had to have been around people who had seen it go through a cycle before, as opposed to everyone running around as if the past never happened. Because certainly the challenges the entertainment industry are going through now are no worse. And in fact, they're a lot less challenging than the arrival of television, than the simultaneous arrival of home video, and the arrival of premium cable services, and the rise of basic cable, which all happened at the same moment and caused an enormous challenge to network, but network still survived it. How about studios? Studios have gone in and out of being at the top of their power. Often the studio has found itself at the mercy of what independent companies were doing, independent companies that didn't have levels of bureaucracy and so could pivot on a dime. Also, with an independent company, you don't have the access to ready capital in quite the same way. If you have a good track record, you definitely do have an access to capital and perhaps even premium access, but you're still not going to be allowed to be profligate, whereas a larger corporation can be. So let's start looking at the winners. The number one winner was Netflix. And I'm sure none of you are surprised by that. First of all, Netflix is an entrepreneurial company. Yes, it might have been initially based in Silicon Valley, and it might have seemed to have all the trappings of a big tech organization. But when you get right down to it, Netflix has never really run 100% like a big tech organization. Some people might make an argument that prior to 2022, when Netflix was the darling and getting venture capital from everywhere, that it was making a lot of irresponsible decisions. Point taken. But as long as there was the promise of money coming in, as long as there was the hint that China was eventually going to be as big a market as North America plus half of Europe combined, there was a much less panic-stricken approach to spending big dollars because there was a hint that more would be coming where that left. Furthermore, Reed Hastings and Ted Sarandos did not live through previous cycles in the entertainment world where too much faith had been given to another country buying massive amounts of American content. For example, in the home video era, for many years, Japan was willing to pay 50% of the budget for almost any project that was greenlit, as long as it had certain key elements. Does this sound familiar? And what ended up happening is that worked well and good as long as the rush to new titles was still a brand new thing. But once it became moribund, once people got tired of seeing garbage that was being fed to them, you started having the little mom and pop stores failing because the customers no longer wanted it. Therefore, the big distributors, Gaga in particular, could no longer sustain their business models. So therefore, within 2 quarters, you saw the amount of purchases Japan was making on the US home video independent companies drop precipitously. Flash forward approximately 10 years, and we come to the era of first-run syndication, where you had shows like Xena, like Hercules, and originally Star Trek: The Next Generation, and of course the show that I worked on called Baywatch. Now, Europe was very hungry for American content, and in that hunger for it, a show like Baywatch, which was funded 100% out of Beta Taurus in Germany and the UK, it was a show that could not be made in those countries. It provoked a fantasy lifestyle of people being able to be on the beach continually, living in a house near the beach and not be multimillionaires. So that was one of the reasons Baywatch was so successful. Plus, it had a huge appeal to older females, never younger males. And so the show worked. It worked because it was basic. It worked because it was easy to translate into other languages, because there was never anything profound about it except for the fact that good-looking people could save lives in an equitable manner. And Xena and Hercules were very popular because they played to their low budget. They did not seem embarrassed by the amount of money they had available. So therefore, they made a lot of fun and amusing shows that audiences gobbled up and enjoyed enormously. At the same time, a lot of fly-by-night companies started doing other first-run syndication shows. And a lot of those shows were completely inept because they did not address key parts of the audience. They did not have the right emotional connection to the characters. And a lot of times their budgets were built around saving money in ways that made their content ridiculous. Let me talk about one show that I had the interesting time working on. It was called Sirens. And what Sirens was about was a group of female police officers in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh. What was the problem with the show? It was shot in Quebec because it was Cavco, it was Canadian content. Therefore, almost all of the supporting players had Canadian French accents. So that meant that almost all of the stories were involved around people who were not local and the immigrant community. Can we say that for a silly Charlie's Angels type show, you could have made that work? But this wasn't that. This was a much more serious show. And Sirens was indicative of almost all of the other shows that were being done. Therefore, Germany pulled out. So therefore, the over-reliance on China had a precedent that said, you better not do this. Where I hold it against certain companies is the fact that their key executives had been around for these other two foreign angel investors pulling out. So those companies in particular do not have an excuse that they did not know what was going on. To Netflix's credit, Netflix pivoted very rapidly when they realized just how disastrous the situation was getting. And that was the second quarter of 2022, where they had lost almost 1 million subscribers. It was not the 2 million they had fearfully predicted, but it was certainly a great increase from the 200,000 they lost in Q1. And so they knew that the trend was soon to become irreversible. So what did they do? They completely changed their business model. And every quarter since, beginning in Q3 of 2022, when their subscriber base jumped by 2 million, then in Q4, it jumped 7. So in other words, they ended up the year in a positive sense of subscribers by a lot. And it was because instead of making their own shows and spending 20 million plus per episode, they started doing a heck of a lot more acquisitions. They started paying money to get shows like Friends and Seinfeld back and making deals with the studios to kind of break up the streaming system into windows, 18 months windows. And they made deals with other studios who, by this point, had spent so much on streaming that they were desperate for any kind of cash. Warner Brothers, in fact, benefited greatly from this. They got a huge infusion of cash from Netflix, not only for Seinfeld and Friends, but for licensing a ton of their animated shows from Cartoon Network. And as we're seeing right now, Cartoon Network look like it's going away. Well, that's because a lot of the contracts that are sitting with Netflix are starting to kick in. So a lot of that programming that you thought you were losing, you're really not. It is switching platforms, though. So Netflix ended up this quarter by going up 16% year over year. That's a very nice increase. And Netflix right now controls approximately 60% of the entire streaming universe. So it might as well be a hegemon. It might as well be the replacement for basic cable that it was originally touted as being, with everyone else making a deal with it in one form or another to put their content up through Netflix's distribution system. Are we worried about monopolistic concerns? Absolutely. But I don't think Amazon Prime is going anywhere. And in spite of the fact that Apple TV Plus is making certain noises that it's going to be rapidly diminishing its original content creation, I don't see them going anywhere either. So it's not going to be a one company universe. So I think very much that it at least has the potential to avoid that and still have tabs for Warner Brothers, for MCA, for Sony, which, by the way, never spent a lot of money on trying to develop its own streaming system, and for that very reason is surviving very nicely. Now let's go to the big one, which is the studio that has caused the most trouble, and that is the Walt Disney Company. In their third quarter report, their third quarter is because their fiscal year is October to September. So it's got a different fiscal year. And surprisingly, the way Bob Iger handled this year's quarterly report was to just answer questions. He didn't give a speech in front of it. And I think there was a definite reason for that. I think he was afraid to give a speech up front because he knew the results were not great and that would open him to getting further questions. Now, the Q&As weren't as softball as the last round of questions, but they certainly weren't really probing in deep. I think it left people unsatisfied because immediately after, the stock fell another $5 to $85. Now, remember, when the whole issue with Nelson Peltz and Ike Perlmutter were trying to get seats on the board, the stock was at 120. That was just last April. So we've seen the stock drop from about 120 to 85 during that period. So it's either a supreme buying opportunity, or people will look at it and say, that was a chance that you should have taken. That was a lifeline you should have taken, but your ego got in the way. I'm not going to say which one that is right now. I am going to say that Disney, at least on paper, has come up with a way to justify that why people should have faith in it. The number one reason is because a little bit ahead of their schedule, in fact, they were able to claim that their streaming services, notice not just Disney Plus anymore, but that their streaming services, which is all their streaming things combined, that includes Hulu, had actually reached the point where they were in net profits. Now, it's not a big net profit, but it's a net profit nonetheless, and it's still a quarter ahead of where they said they would be. Now, very, very carpy people will look at this and go, wait a minute, what are you talking about here? Yeah, they're in net profits, but you've included the entire Huluverse without any mention of the fact that you still haven't closed the deal for Hulu. What do I mean by that? Well, NBC Universal and Disney are still going back and forth about the boot that has to come between the money that Disney was already obligated to pay and what the projections of what Hulu is worth now in order to for NBC Universal to get their proper share of what the company is worth. And of course, NBC Universal's been saying, oh, we're looking at maybe getting another 10 to 15 billion. And Disney's saying, oh, it's not even worth what you paid for it, but we know we're obligated to pay it. And it looks like Disney might have to kick in an extra $5 billion in order to cover that. That's not a good piece of news. And if that had closed before the numbers came in, it would have completely decimated that narrative of them being in positive. But that's not the real concern, because it looks like Disney, in terms of content creation, has gotten back on the right side of the business model. And that is, look at the success of Deadpool and look at the success of Inside Out 2. Here are two movies where Disney went back to its old school tradition of how this type of movie should be made. Audience pleasing, lots of exciting characters, not lectury, and overall something where people will want to see them multiple times. Now, I've only seen each one once, but trust me, if I weren't so in my dotage, I would have probably gone to have seen both of them multiple times if I was in my younger days, because both of them I felt delivered very hard in terms of what an audience wants and what I like watching in a movie. Now, are they perfect? No. Are they going to come anywhere near my top 100 favorite movies? No. But then again, almost nothing enters that now at my age. But because the older you get, the more you get locked in on what you liked, and it's very hard to break into that. But I would certainly never have a problem seeing them again. Let's put it that way. And if the opportunity comes, if one of my friends went, I'll certainly go because they were good. So, but they still have a lot of damage to undo. Since last year, you had so many failures. And neither of these is quite big enough to make up for the tremendous losses that those big failures of last year, like the Marbles and Dial of Destiny and Ant-Man and Wasp, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not enough for that, but it's on the right track. And it does indeed create an ancillary market again. So maybe if they don't blow it with Captain America and a bunch of and the Moana 2 and the Mustafa, if those come out okay, which I think they will, because I know they're furiously retooling some of them to make sure that they don't cause a problem. So I think that that part of Disney is positive enough where we can be bullish on it. The surprise, although it shouldn't have been a surprise, is what's happening with the parks. That Disney's parks have gone from being something that the average family wants to go to on a regular basis to being something that's so expensive that most people go, no, thank you. I really don't want to spend that kind of money. And among my friends who go all the time, unlike me, I used to go all the time, by the way. I used to have a Disney park back when it was $200. And then it included parking. No, it's not that anymore, obviously. But back when I would go all the time, the prices have become outrageous. And I'm not talking about, well, so is inflation. I'm talking about way above and beyond it. Worse, one of the things Disney has done is it's become very classist and overtly so. And when I say overtly so, parents always saw how classist Disney could be. But now kids are seeing it. Why? Because let's say you're going to Disneyland and you're a kid and you don't really understand economics, and you're going with your folks who really struggled hard to make this happen. And you're trying to get on rides and you're standing in a line, and these other people are allowed to go through ahead of you. And you're told, well, those are lightning lane peoples. And you find out that lightning lane is an extra fee per person above the $165 to get in, above all of those other fees. They're still asking a per person bump. Back to the old e-tickets, right? They'll never say, let's just bring back e-tickets and call it a day. But it's like an e-ticket where you only had a certain number you could use. And I see that Disney's trying to reinstate all of that. But what it's done is it's shown that, oh, my parents aren't rich enough for us to get to appreciate these rides. Those kids have rich parents. So what Disney has done is it's emphasized the lack of social equality. And for a lot of parents, spending 10 grand for a trip to Disneyland is a lot of money, especially now. So their attendance is getting a little rocky. There's been complaints about the cleanliness of the parks. There's been complaints, a lot of it because, the problem with a lot of YouTube videos, as much as I love YouTube and all of that, is that you get a couple of videos of fights that are happening in Disneyland. And these are exceptionally rare. You get a couple of videos that make it out there about those fights, and now you're thinking those fights are all the time. And so the park doesn't feel safe. Is it safe? I believe so. But by the videos that are out there and very ubiquitous, because if it bleeds, it leads. You have a lot of people believing that Disneyland is not safe. So now the parks are getting hit. Now, when Disneyland says we're going to be spending $60 billion over the next 10 years, that's $6 billion a year in order to improve the parks. Well, now you got a lot of people saying, well, is that just basic maintenance? Or it's mostly from overseas parks. And you're like, really? So you're not going to take care of your home turf? Not a good look. And this is all avoidable, and yet it wasn't avoided. Okay, so Disney has to fix this. Will they? Of course they will. The parks bring in too much safety. The parks are now bringing in approximately $35 million in revenues a day. A $35 million revenue a day means you can say, well, actually, a disastrous movie that cost $300 million is only 10 days worth of park revenues. I mean, of course, we haven't calculated in the expenses yet. But yeah, it doesn't seem as cataclysmic because you get to understand how big the whole Disney empire is with all of its pieces. So it's enough to, I think, make Disney one of the dogs of the Dow, one of the bad stocks on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So we'll see if they fix themselves. I'm not seeing enough action. Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers is down to $7 a share. The company is having to write down a lot of its assets, especially in the linear realm of the basic cable channels. And I'm going to do a little aside here. Yes, the linear channels are considered to not have a lot of value. Yet, if you look at the reporting, you see that the networks, which Warner Brothers doesn't have anymore, they gave off the CW to Nexstar. But when you look at the networks that are out there, they're still very good in terms of returning profits. Yes, all of the networks are down approximately 10% year over year, as befitting a style of media that's getting older, as befitting an ad market that now has all of the streaming service ad tiers, in addition to YouTube, in addition to all those other organizations, as people who want to buy ads. It is definitely an ad buyer's market right now across the board. So, of course, it's going to get increasingly difficult for the ad sellers, which are the networks, which are the streaming services that have ad tiers, which is YouTube and all of that. It's going to get increasingly difficult for them to find buyers. And the buyers are going to be able to pick and choose where their ads go. Even within that realm, most of the networks made well over 10 to 12 billion dollars in pre-sales. So we're talking about an amount of money that's being spent that's very robust still for the old media. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is the moment you say we put a stake in linear TV's heart prematurely because we thought streaming was going to be such a big bounty that we lost a secondary source of revenue. We put a stake in the heart of the vampire of physical media because we thought that was going to start cannibalizing or not allow us to make as much money as we wanted on streaming. And now look, now you're having people needing revenue sources from a different window. And in the United States, you've made physical media niche. Whereas before it had been the number one. Now we knew it wasn't going to stay number one. We knew it was going to be supplanted. But that doesn't mean you get rid of it. Look at what happened with vinyl. Vinyl has been gone since the early 80s. And now you're seeing more vinyl sold than CDs. And you might say, well, that's all physical media. Who cares? It's still a huge market. And guess what? Asia loves physical media. There's a reason why Sony cut a deal with Disney in order to distribute the physical media windows of all the Disney content and the 20th Century Fox stuff, which, by the way, Disney still hasn't used. So what does this have to do with Warner Brothers? Well, with Warner Brothers, what Zaslav, for all of his criticism, of all the criticism to him about what a cheapskate he is and all of that, he was the only person who was willing to try to give Warner Brothers a chance to come back as a studio. Otherwise, it would have been broken up for parts long ago, when AT&T would have just broken it up for parts and sold the lots. I know, no, everyone's saying, oh, no, they went. Yes, they would have. It was that bad when they got to look at the books closely. It was that bad. So, Zaslav's trying to fix it. He's trying by not throwing good money after the bad. Sometimes he had to because of foreign sales or foreign co-production deals. And I think he was ahead of the game until all of a sudden the interest rates doubled, more than doubled, and they've got short-term fund. They've got $40 billion of debt, and they don't have enough revenue to really cover that. Is Warner Brothers going to go away? I don't think so, because I think they have enough in terms of their assets and in terms of their potential to where they might have to form a strategic alliance with someone else. But I think they're going to be able to make it past this. I know that they said their basic cable stuff wasn't worth anything anymore, but I also think they're being a little bit cagey there, because a lot of that stuff is now on Max and Discovery Plus, which is merging with Max. So they're kind of cannibalizing their cable numbers by incorporating it with their streaming numbers. And that's a strategic play, because then they can put all of their debt, they can spin off half the company, the HBO Max side and the feature film side, and leave the original Warner Brothers Discovery stuck with a bag of debt, which, you'll just say, well, figure it out and see what happens there. I mean, if the FCC allows that, I'm not sure they will. I'm not sure the SEC or the FCC will allow that to go through, but we'll see if that happens. But either way, it was really the interest rates that hurt. Interest rates have been a problem for every one of the studios, and it's kind of the reason for most of the nightmare. Sony has been doing fine. It's not been a great year for it, but it hasn't been a terrible year. So I think Sony is chugging along, and ultimately it will prove itself to be a resilient survivor. And Sony, as usual, is making sure that a lot of its assets are being covered by the fact that it's in so many different businesses back in Dainippon Teikoku. Let's look at next Paramount. Well, we know Paramount is in play for Skydance, so whatever their results are doesn't matter. It really doesn't. Yeah, you got the triumvirate there right now, trying to see what they can do to make it a viable entity. Are they going to be able to sell the land? That might be a little bit more difficult now than it would have been, let's say, 2 years ago, because I think the losses in real estate for speculative development have been extreme enough, and the challenges of so much vacant commercial space has made tearing down the lot and building some kind of development in there, whether it's a business park, whether it's whether it's retail or shared space. I don't think it's necessarily going to pencil out the way it would have earlier. So I think for the short term, at least the lot and the operations within it will probably keep going, but we'll have to revisit this next quarter as the deal starts getting closer and closer. Still not going to close till next fall, but we're going to be hearing more and more news on it. What's Amazon doing? Amazon, even though MGM has not quite yet turned out to be what it needs to be for Amazon, I do believe that MGM will turn out to be a very good buy for them because of the infrastructure and the knowledge of what works and what doesn't. So, especially with things that are lower budget, with talent in it that can be very variable based on what program they're in, I think that there's a nice opportunity for that to happen. And certainly they would not have thought about creating a secondary label with United Artists unless they had a sense, whether it's through research, whether it's through projections, whether it's through paying attention to different metrics that they're not quite revealing to the public at large yet. I think that there's still that move of saying we're going to restart United Artists is a pretty big indicator that they feel everything will be okay. The final one we'll look at is Comcast. Now, Comcast year over year has improved and for their third quarter numbers. They've had a little bit less revenue, but their profit on the amount of money that they've made has gone up. So they're definitely in a much more comfortable area. And remember that just like Amazon and just like Disney, Comcast, NBC Universal has a huge moat of protection because the actual filmmaking and creative part of the company isn't a dominant part of the entire corporation as a whole. Most of Comcast remains cable and that development. They're, I believe, second or maybe third to Amazon Web Services in terms of being the internet provider for most of the corporations in the country and globally. So Comcast can look at NBC Universal as a loss leader at this stage because it's about 15% of their business as a whole. And they've been fairly robust in that cable and internet arena. So whatever their numbers are fine. And of course, in a year when you have Nintendo World coming up and their revenues in that jumping, I think 20% from last year, really nice increase. Disney better start worrying because that's a pretty big increase. With that happening, with them not throwing good money after the bad, with Peacock, with them now licensing titles out in their first windows to Amazon Prime for dramas and comedies and animation going to Netflix, they got money coming in, so they should be fine. The bottom line for all of this is that as the industry goes through changes, we've had incredible amounts of people losing their job. And that's very sad for right now. But it's a reset. And whatever your job was in the past, whatever your career ambition was, as you thought, should I get into entertainment now? Bottom line is still above the percentage increase in the population. There are 3 times more jobs now than there were when I graduated. And so there will be other increases, there will be other opportunities. My feeling, again, is that all of the studios are looking at more efficient productions, meaning lower budget, meaning more emotionally oriented. So think independent.
Well, speaking of horses, I like to play them myself. But I like to see them work out a little first. See if they're front runners or come from behind. Find out what their whole card is. What makes them run.
Find out mine?
I think so.